Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video, we'll be covering how we can use an individual's performance to apply progressive overload for hypertrophy training. Before we delve into the details of progressive overload for hypertrophy training, we first need to briefly cover some hypertrophy fundamentals. The first variable to cover is proximity to failure. Trainees should take each set of training fairly close to failure to maximize hypertrophy adaptations. Around 1 to 3 reps in reserve should generally be the average proximity to failure for the majority of hypertrophy training. Ensuring that we are taking sets close enough to failure, the next most important training variable for muscle growth is volume. Volume refers to the number of sets trained per muscle group per week. Each muscle group has a minimum amount of volume required for muscle growth and a maximum amount that a trainee can recover and adapt to. Here is a very general guide of some average volume ranges for each muscle group. And the last fundamental variable of hypertrophy training is the load and rep ranges used. Hypertrophy can be achieved across a large spectrum of load and rep ranges. A good practical recommendation would be to train in the 6 to 20 rep range for most of the trainee's total weekly volume. Now that we have briefly covered these fundamental training variables, let's now explore what progressive overload is and its importance for hypertrophy training. Progressive overload is the principle of making training more difficult over time. This doesn't mean that every single session needs to be harder than the previous one, but it means that over months and years, training should become harder over time. Progressive overload can be applied in many different ways. We can increase the load lifted, volume, reps, distance ran, speed of running, duration of exercise, and more. For hypertrophy training specifically, we essentially want to see an increase in load lifted over time within the 6 to 20 rep range. Or put another way, we want to see more reps performed with the same load in the 6 to 20 rep range. So if a trainee can lift more weight for more reps over time, they are likely growing muscle. Although we want progressive overload to occur, the application of progressive overload has some issues for hypertrophy training. The issue with prescribing strict progressive overload is that it assumes we know exactly how a trainee will respond to training. However, it is almost impossible to predict how a trainee will respond to a training program and how performance may vary on a day-to-day basis. To highlight this issue, let's use the dumbbell bench press as an example. As we can see here, we have prescribed 3 sets of 10 at 35 kilos for week 1, 3 sets of 11 at 35 kilos for week 2, 3 sets of 12 at 35 kilos for week 3, and 3 sets of 13 at the same weight for week 4. This program applies progressive overload, although it is very rigid. The trainee may not be able to progress this fast from week to week, or they may actually be able to progress even faster. But because the program is so strict, the trainee cannot progress at their own individual rate. So for hypertrophy training, we don't necessarily need to directly prescribe progressive overload. Progressive overload can be thought of as a result of muscle growth, rather than prescribed to induce hypertrophy. This means that as the muscle gets bigger, it will naturally be able to perform more reps and more load in the 6 to 20 rep range. If the muscle hasn't gotten bigger, then the trainee won't be able to improve performance. So progressive overload should occur naturally as an adaptation to good hypertrophy training. So rather than directly prescribing progressive overload, we can use performance to make informed decisions for our training program. As we mentioned previously, we want athletes to perform more weight for more reps in the 6 to 20 rep range as a progression for hypertrophy training. If a trainee tracks their training performance, it can be used to write the next program. We can track our progress by recording how many reps were performed at what load. So rather than prescribing strict reps, sets, and loads, we can prescribe the number of sets to ensure we're doing enough volume, the load to make sure we are lifting roughly in the correct rep range, and the reps in reserve to ensure that we are taking each set close enough to failure. Then we can use rep performance as a gauge of progress. For example, let's use the dumbbell bench press again. As we can see in this 4-week mesocycle, the program remains exactly the same apart from week 1, which uses a lower volume as a deload week. The trainee will then perform each set with the rough 1 to 2 reps in reserve range and record how many reps were performed. If our training program is successful, we should see an increase in reps performed on average over the course of the 4 weeks. So how can we use our performance to apply progressive overload? Well, there are a few different variables we can manipulate based on how the trainee is responding to training. The first adjustment we can make is to actually change nothing at all. If the trainee is improving performance over time with the current program, then they can continue training with the same variables for the next mesocycle. For example, let's use the same example of the dumbbell bench press once again. As we can see here, the trainee is performing more reps over time as an adaptation to the training program. Therefore, we can use the same programming variables once again in the next mesocycle. The second application of progressive overload is to increase the load lifted. This can be done if the trainee is improving performance at a given load and the rep ranges they are performing are getting too high. By increasing the load lifted, the rep ranges will reduce and the trainee can then increase reps over time once again. For example, let's use the dumbbell bench press once again. As we can see here, the trainee is performing reps in the 15 to 20 range on average over the mesocycle. Therefore, the next mesocycle may look something like this. We have maintained all variables, although the load has now increased to 37.5 kilos. This will allow the trainee to perform their sets in a slightly lower rep range. The third application of progressive overload is to increase volume. This should be applied if the trainee isn't seeing improvements in performance over time. If they aren't performing more reps over the mesocycle on average, the total volume may not be high enough to provide hypertrophy adaptations. By increasing total weekly volume for a particular muscle group, the hypertrophy dose should be greater. For example, let's use the dumbbell bench press once again. As we can see here, the trainee is failing to see any noticeable improvements in reps performed over the 4-week mesocycle. So in the following mesocycle, they may increase the number of sets performed to increase the total weekly volume. And the last form of progressive overload that we can apply is to change exercises. This should be changed if the trainee has tried all the other methods of progressive overload already and has reached a plateau. By incorporating a new exercise into the program, the trainee can adapt to a new stimulus. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.